Cool.
Oh.
Hello.
Hey, Sigfried.
So my internet is a little inconsistent here. If I robot consistently, let me know.
What was that? Your internet's inconsistent?
Maybe so. I have a backup. If that happens a couple times, I'll stop and switch to another internet provider. And it's more expensive, but it's much better.
Okay. Hotspot. I don't know if it's enough.
Yeah, yeah. Because I roam around, I'm always on a wireless internet. Normally, I have AT&T, and I have this kind of bootleg unlimited thing. But it's kind of bad here. I have Verizon, but it's limited. So when I use it, and this stuff gobbles it up like crazy. So, but I'll do that if it comes to it. Let's see. So we're here to talk about the origins of morality and law and what that means for us. So kind of my goal is to, we've discussed this a little on different places, but to go over some of that because I feel like there's some explanations I can offer that I kind of want to help you understand my perspective. Not necessarily agree with it. I don't expect that. Just looking for understanding. And then kind of towards the end of the debate, we can talk about the practical applications, what that means, respectively for our worldviews in society and how we operate. So, and all kind of the contention that at the end it doesn't matter all that much, but we'll get to that. So I'll start a little bit, talk about my view. So I think that morality is subjective inherently. That's not the same as moral relativism, which is kind of a different idea. But moral subjectivism simply means that morality comes from human beings. We are the source and actors of morality, and that's kind of inescapable for us. And that all morality originates from human beings in some way, shape, or form. And that is always enacted out by human beings in some way, shape, or form. Inherently subjective, with subjective meaning coming from the human experience, the human mind, the human perspective, and specifically from individual humans. So kind of claim number 2 is that morality is intrinsically a social phenomenon. Human beings are social animals. We live and survive in social groups, even if that just means a family group. Moral rules don't have much meaning outside of a social context. So if there's not other people around, then murder doesn't mean anything. If there's not other people around, theft doesn't mean anything. None of what we normally consider rights or moral obligations have any meaning if there's not other people with us in a social group. Or if we don't have any kind of agreement between people, then we just, it's just law of fist in that case. Humans create morals for the purpose of social cooperation. So the reason we have is so that we can get along together in society and work with one another, or at least have a peaceable relationship between us. So number 3 is that we get our morals from many sources. Some of them spring from our instinctual impulses as social creatures. We come out of the womb feeling things like fear and love and attachment, and these form part of the kind of the core impulse that drives a lot of our emotions. Many moral systems are taught to us. We're trained by our parents or other teachers. So that's where we learn or get a lot of our moral ideas. We're not necessarily born with them. Many more are absorbed from a wider social context that isn't as formal, but it nonetheless persists. And then, we develop some of our own by reason. There are moral innovators in the world who come up with new moral ideas and put them forth. So we codify these things in society in various ways to build societies. Religion's a good example of codified morality. Secular laws are another form of codified morality. Not every law is intrinsically moral, but a lot of them are secondary off of moral principles. So, thing, not because it's intrinsically immoral, but because it leads to harm to other people, and that would be immoral. Social norms are also codified morals. They're just less codified. They're not as often written down. They're passed orally or just through natural social interaction. And then many philosophies represent kind of moral systems that are created that are somewhere in between religious and secular law. Morality is often in conflict, so individuals conflict on their given morals. That happens all the time. Groups of individuals, societies conflict on their morals and they fight about them. And individuals within societies conflict on the morals. So the society may have a set of morals and an individual may not agree with all of them. And sometimes that causes conflict. Sometimes people just accept it. Force of one kind or another always determines moral outcomes in the end. So that could be violence, but it could also be the force of reason, the force of persuasion, deal-making force, social pressure, things like that. So these are all different kinds of force. So when I say force in this debate, that's usually what I mean. I'll often talk about violence because that's kind of the ultimate trump card. When you go there, there's not really any more force to go to. The strongest of whatever kind of force you're using tends to win these conflicts. And creates what I would call a prevailing morality. It doesn't change everyone's moral view, but it's the one that gets enforced. And then individuals still maintain their subjective morals inside of the system. So even if my morals differ from the US government, the US government holds sway in society, gets to determine moral punishments, but I can still resist that and not necessarily agree with it. So they don't change my morality. So both those kinds of morality coexist at the same time. So that's kind of an overview of my perspective of how moral systems work. And it's not based on a sort of philosophical standard, but just sort of me observing the way the world is and trying to put that into an orderly system.
Okay. So what should we talk about?
Well, I mean, you can either critique some of my views, which I've heard some of your critiques before, but I like explaining the answers, or you can go ahead and kind of introduce your moral perspective. It's probably useful.
Okay. Well, I kind of talked about this the night before last with Daniel, and I come from the Christian, you could say Judeo-Christian theistic point of view, where I believe in natural law type principles, so that man was created in the image of God, and that's why man is important and set above all creatures. He's above other animals, given dominion over the earth. Man was created to work the earth, not to just abuse the earth. And that's, but that the earth was created for humans. That, the fall is where we get our idea that man is fallen. And so it's that man deserves protection because he's created in the image of God, special, and needs protection, like the rights that God has granted to humans need protection because man is fallen and man has selfish desires and wicked heart. And so you see there are a lot of people out there that would use force to take another individual's property. And so I think the basic principles of property, John Locke, life, liberty, and property, I think those are basic biblical principles. You can say, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, things like that. And covet doesn't mean want, but it means like, I in your heart, if you covet something, I really want to take that person's property. And covetous leads to theft, and theft being immoral. So basic morals come from kind of those basic principles. And you could talk 10 Commandments, and laws are written on man's heart. So I do definitely believe in a universal morality. I think violence to get your way, violence as a defensive principle is perfectly valid. If you're attacking me and I kill you, I think that's a perfectly valid thing. And I'm actually going to get into that probably more tomorrow when we discuss gun rights and the basic principles of that with tomorrow with Daniel and possibly Ben on Saturday. So
should be good.
I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the basic principles I think that I would believe in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you view other, now I often use this subjective versus objective kind of standard. You use the word universal. So what do you mean by universal?
Yeah, so I think everybody appeals to a universal morality. I mean, we're hearing, whether you're a theist or an atheist, we hear people saying that the mass shooting is wrong. Where do you get the idea that it's wrong? It wasn't wrong to the individual who did it, because he did it. So he must have thought it was good and proper. Maybe he thinks that it was necessary, right? People appeal to universal principles pretty much in almost everything they do. We condemn, people don't actually believe that law creates morality, because we condemn people that create, quote unquote, bad law, right? So we can,
Sure. Yeah.
we condemn Hitler. You know, it was perfectly legal to stick Jews in a, let's go right there, right? We're 10 minutes in. Let's let's talk about Hitler.
Yeah, let's talk about Hitler. Sure, sounds good.
So I mean, obviously it was legal. So, he's a dictator. He creates the laws, he creates the morality. So putting Jews in ovens was good, at least in that society.
Right,
yeah, or in the whole society. I mean, it was a legal thing. I mean,
I would say for those in that society who agreed with those laws.
Okay, well then,
although the oven programs, that was kind of a, I mean, that was sort of a secret. It was a state secret, right? During Nazi Germany, they didn't publicize that they were trying to kill all the Jews. They said they were trying to move them out of their territory, but we found out later that was mostly a lie, and that they were actually trying to exterminate large numbers of them. But
it was a dictatorship. I mean, it was a democratic dictatorship. He was democratically elected before an
elected dictator, yeah.
Yeah, Chavez was the same way, right? He's democratically elected. Everybody loves him. And he says, "Hey, I'm so wonderful. I'm going to be president for life. Now I'm dictator for life," right?
Not everybody loves him, but yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of people loved him. Yeah, a lot of people loved him when he came. Well, all of Hollywood loved him until his policies started to come into fruition, and people started starving. I'm a big fan of Lily Tang Williams. I think. Actually posted a video. She ran for senator, I think, or Congress in Colorado, and she came from China, and she talks about how her life in China was, it was miserable. Her grandfather taught her how to catch rats, but even rats, you even run out of rats because everybody's trying to catch rats, right? So if anybody can see that.
I was once a slave, and I will never be one again.
Yeah, so she had her AR-15.
I like that.
She had her AR-15, and she says if they had AR-15s in China, you'd see a different history. If they had her
they have AR-15s. It's just the government has them.
Yes, and that's kind of the point. Is that that's kind of the point that I would get to in that discussion.
Right. Save the gun debate, but
but I just think it's a basic right. It's a basic human right. Sure. I don't want to tip my hand too much in case somebody's watching.
Sure. No, that's good. No, we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But so let's talk about Hitler a little bit. I mean, so in my view, in a subjective moral view, Hitler had his own set of moral views that he propagated. Some people agreed with him, some people didn't. And if they agreed, they didn't necessarily agree on every point he made. Some yes, some no. But we're going to choose because we like more of his views than we don't. And when he started to do terrible things, some people broke ranks with him. Some people, famously tried to smuggle Jews out of the country and save their lives. So just because a society codifies a set of moral standards doesn't mean it changes the morality of each individual person. It might. People do change their minds. They have changing moral opinions. But it doesn't necessarily universally apply just because there's laws of society. And it doesn't require, as a member of society, that you agree with all the laws or moral views expressed by the leadership. Because fundamentally, you always maintain your individual ability to make a moral choice and to decide what you think is good and what you think is evil. You may not always be able to enact that choice, in the sense you can't change other people's views necessarily, or you cannot force other people to obey your rules unless you have sufficient power. But nonetheless, you maintain your individual morality no matter what. When I look at, say, the Christian religion, for instance, I see many different moral views within the umbrella of Christianity. So there are some commonalities to which they revere Christ as Lord and Savior. Pretty much everybody, if you're a Christian, that's central tenet, right? But beyond that, whether you accept homosexuality or not, whether you believe that you can be saved through works or be saved by faith alone, there are many different fundamental differences in moral views between Christians. And as time goes on, individuals who are a member of a church see something in the church that just does not feel right to them, right? Either in the way it works out in society or based on their reading of the Bible, they just fundamentally disagree. And they end up forming their own new congregations. More often than not, they split off, they form a new body politic, they come up with a new set of rules and interpretations, often very similar to what was before, but different in some fundamental way. And that is an expression of the idea that even if we were to accept the idea that God is a moral lawgiver, individual human beings and societies will nonetheless interpret it based on their own thinking, their own reasoning, their own feelings, and they don't have any escape from that because none of us is a perfect mind, right? None of us are God. So even if God is real, human limitations, you might call it sin nature, but let's just say that we're not infinite minds either, will lead us to individual versions and views of morality that will differentiate and bifurcate and then get codified in different religious sects or in different societies. And so to me, we end up in the exact same place. Each individual is responsible for their moral views. Where they get them from, whether they try to justify them through God or whether they say that I've learned these through experience and reason, which is the more atheist kind of view, you're going to end up with the same society. One in which each individual fights for what they think is right, and depending on the effectiveness of their power, be it persuasion, force, whatever, or their willingness to join with other people to create greater power, which is how societies and churches form, they will tussle over these things, and you'll never have just one unless you're right and God descends from the heavens, judges everybody, sorts it all out. Then, well, we've just got one moral view. But until then, no matter the justification, we're stuck with this thing. Even if you say there's a universal morality, if we can't agree on what it is, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I would say that how people view morality, people do see different things as moral, but in the end, you talked, really going really quickly back to the Hitler thing. In Nuremberg, these were acts against humanity. They called upon universal moral laws. They didn't say, well, each individual decides for themselves, and we've decided that we should fry you, hang you, whatever. No, they decided on, again, universal moral laws. And even within the Christian sects, yes, you have the Catholics that, they have the Pope, and he makes Catholic decisions, which I think is not Christian, but because of the Pope. But either way, different popes make different decisions, which I think is a problem in and of itself for the Catholic Church. But either way,
I would agree.
They are saying that however in each individual sees morality changing within the Christian church, yes, there are a lot of churches that see, same-sex marriage. They've maybe changed their minds, but that doesn't mean that there's not a universal, or that the Bible doesn't teach. I mean, I think the Bible very specifically teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman, biblically speaking. Now, if man and man want to go do their thing, whatever.
I don't know that it's.
But
yeah, I would agree. I don't know that it's a big focus of the Bible, but it talks about it a little bit at least.
I think it's pretty important. I mean, it was since the beginning.
Important, yes.
That man would leave his mother and father and cleave into his wife, and the two shall become one. So I think it's a very important principle in the Bible that's taught. Now, he didn't go over it, but I think Jesus had a very specific goal in mind, and so I mean, he didn't come here to teach everybody you should do. The Bible says things, what you should and should not do, right? And so, I think it's pretty clear in there. But either way, whether or not individuals decide, they look around and say, "Oh my," I even read there's a big mega church. Well, big surprise, mega church in Seattle, pastor, right, writes a blog that's supporting same-sex marriage. What he said in the blog was basically, I looked around, I have friends that are, two guys, and they're make a good couple, and therefore I'm changing my mind. So that doesn't mean that, but that doesn't mean that the universal morality isn't there, right? Individuals can look around and see that, I have a friend who's 15, not really, but let's just say I have a friend who's 15. She got knocked up by her boyfriend. She's really in trouble. Is abortion wrong? And I might say, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, there's a story. I think he's a congressman. I read that. So I just heard that on the radio. Yeah.
And the abortion guy tells his girlfriend, maybe you could get an abortion so nobody will find out now.
Yeah. And so
it's critical.
Yeah. So, I mean, we obviously see a lot of that. People change their mind for different reasons, right? We don't know what his actual principle was. We just know that in the situation, situational ethics for this guy, but it doesn't mean that there's not even a universal morality there, that murder is wrong.
And I agree with that. You know, I never sort of claim that I know that there is no universal morality. You know, because I'm technically part agnostic, part atheist, whether you're talking philosophical or practical, right? I'm an atheist because I don't worship a god, so obviously I'm not a believer. I'm an agnostic in the sense that I don't claim to know universal truth, right? I don't. Maybe there is a god, and I just couldn't, or don't know him, right? That's okay. So there might be a universal morality. I do kind of point back to my points that morality doesn't mean much outside of society, and I would also say that every human moral code that we have, that human beings follow, came from a human somewhere. Now you would say that the Bible was inspired by God, but of course I can't know that. They also say the Bhagavad Gita is inspired by God, and the ancient books of the Egyptians are inspired by God. There's a lot of things, claims that gods did things. What I know is that somewhere a human being must have wrote it down. Now, how he was inspired, I don't necessarily know, but a human being did write those things down, and human beings do promulgate them as the source. So I know that a human being, at least, is intermediary in that process. I don't know whether some greater power is behind it or not. So hard for me to judge that. So I'm going to say it is possible, but in the end, it ends up not really mattering. Now, we should talk a little bit about Nuremberg trials and appeals to a universal morality.
Actually, really quick though, you mentioned this with Daniel in your discussion. The idea of you're walking through the woods alone. Do rights exist? Does morality exist? And I would say that yes, morality still exists, even if I am the only person on earth. You know, thou shalt not murder. It would at least apply to myself. I should not murder myself, but.
What immoral action could you perform by yourself?
Well, it's saying that I could murder myself, and I could do various other immoral actions.
Well, suicide. Okay.
My sword, yeah.
But what kind of a right is not to be suicided? That doesn't.
Well, yeah. So I think rights in terms of what the government can and cannot do, things like that. But I think as far as a morality.
Okay.
As far as morality, killing suicide would be immoral. Now, I would also think that I have, as far as the government goes, I have a right to do it. Government. I don't think the government owns me. I think the basic principle of liberty is that you own yourself, and then you go from there. You can.
I tend to agree. I mean, I'm a classic liberal in that sense. I justify it in a different mechanism. I justify it by common human desires, which speaks to universal morality. So my theory of, some people would say, we haven't got into it, but it's a common thing. Well, what about murder? Everyone thinks murder is wrong, right? That's pretty much a universal moral code.
Pretty much everybody. I mean, there are Ravi Zacharias says, some societies like to love their neighbor. Some societies eat their neighbor. Which one do you think?
Sure, yeah. Well, and there's two responses I tend to make. One is what you just said, except that I would say that murder is illegal killing. So it's killing for the wrong reasons. Most human societies allow killing for, as you say, self-defense or some other reason. There are pure pacifists who say no killing at all. It's pretty rare. However, generally murder is killing for the wrong reasons. And
without justification.
Right. Societies vary widely in what they think is justified and what isn't, right? That's the big problem a lot of the time is what justifies it and what doesn't. I tend to be pretty conservative in the sense that I don't think there's a lot of good excuses for it. Self-defense being one of the few that I ascribe to. But that kind of says that murder is a little more complicated, right? The other one is it's kind of common sense. Most people don't want to be killed. So if we're in a society, we have an agreement that we won't kill each other, right? I'm not going to cooperate with you if you're going to kill me, right? There's the absolute no reason that you and I can agree on anything if we can't agree that we shouldn't kill each other, right? So it's so common to a functional society that it is a near universal norm that you do not kill people of your group. And that's again changes through time. I'm always happy when we expand the notion of who our fellow man is, right, and that we don't kill anymore. But so I think there's a lot of things, and not stealing. Again, it's very dysfunctional in society if people are constantly taking your stuff. Now, some very hierarchical societies are based without any property rights. I mean, human beings had monarchies for thousands of years. They really, it's like the king owns everything, and he tells you what you're allowed to keep and not keep, right? And the liberalism revolution was really about saying, the hell with that. We're done with that crap. Everything belongs to their own person. We're going to enter into societies. We're going to make agreements about, what we're willing to share and what we aren't, right?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it was at least the modern sense, it was a call to upon natural law. Right.
Yeah. Locke is definitely the key of it. Now, like, again, for me, it's a very fine distinction. I say natural law is kind of bunk because man never existed without society. Man has always at least had a family, right? And there's always hierarchy in a family. Children, parents, mother, husband, wife, that sort of thing. I mean, that always existed. It's just intrinsic to who we are. But natural rights, the individual sovereignty, that's the word I like to use, that we each deserve our own sovereignty at a base as a human desire is what I appeal to. We all want to be free. We all want to be sovereign unto ourselves to some degree. We also all want to cooperate with other people, and I hopefully recognize that requires sacrifice and compromise occasionally. So that's how we should form society, is through, mostly, at least, voluntary participation. You're always going to have some people that don't want to participate, right? And they make trouble. But,
yeah, and I mean, you're going to have a lot of people out there that don't really necessarily want to be free either.
Well, that's true. There's also a desire. Well, there's a desire to be taken care of, a kind of inherent laziness, But in a way, if you think about it, there's a certain sovereignty in that. It's like, what I want for myself is to be provided for and to not have to worry too much, right? That's my sovereign desire. And it does come into conflict when you have a lot of people on one side. You have different kinds of people. That's one of the reasons I think government has to be flexible, because there are different desires. But anywho, so that's my take on universal morality. It's to a common human experience. Human beings, not every last one of them, right? But most human beings are gonna line up, and fortunately, that means in societies we're gonna have more agreement than not. We mostly agree. No stealing, no murdering. People do it anyway, but when people break the law, usually they have like one of three things. Either one, they know it's wrong and they're doing it anyway, right? Two, they don't think it's wrong. Three, they have no moral center whatsoever. People who are purely, broken brain, they don't understand morality, right? They're just purely selfish in a natural way, I guess. Psychopaths.
Again, I think there's the universal standard. People do know it's wrong. And, even, and this is something else I'd say, is when people are rioting and saying, demanding the government ought to do X, Y, and Z, they're always saying it's the right thing to do, or, we have a right to, even though the government has said, no, we're not going to recognize this action. So again, I think, people are saying, and whether or not they really understand it or not, they just tend to appeal to a universal, what they believe is a universal morality. I would disagree with it, but say the whole same-sex marriage thing was, this is we have a right to, and now,
right. Well, yeah, it's doing it for years. If they're not hurting, don't worry about it.
Yeah, well,
and that is an appeal to a moral standard.
Yeah, and I think maybe not moral standard, but in there,
it is a moral standard. The moral standard is they have an individual sovereignty to form relationships, and unless that sovereignty damages your sovereignty, you should leave them alone.
Well, they've been doing it for decades. I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't illegal, and many people had done it. It
was illegal for a long time.
No, I mean, people
up until the 1960s, there were sodomy laws. I mean, there's a lot of famous Supreme Court cases in that regard.
I mean, there's still a lot of laws out there. I mean, Texas still have the law, but
they just can't enforce them right now.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't enforced for the most part. And so it's been these things had been done for decades, and so it wasn't really the act of marriage; it was the act of recognition. And in my view, it was
legal rights.
A lot of people wanted to make other people recognize it, and so I think that's
they don't like being oppressed for it. They don't like being taunted or ridiculed for their lifestyle. I mean, nobody does like that, right? You wouldn't like being ridiculed for being a Christian. I don't want to be ridiculed for being homosexual.
Believe me, it's not that much fun. No.
Yeah, no, obviously,
go on the internet as a guy who as a creationist, So there you go.
Yeah, well, I try to respect those so long as, again, I have the moral value. If you're not hurting me, if you're not impinging on my moral sovereignty, I'm not too concerned with what you're doing. But I'm not use my force to mess around with your life, right?
And so I would, for the most part, agree with that it's not the government's job, would be my stance on a lot of those issues.
Yeah.
So it's not the government's job to get involved in these things. That's a long, complicated issue,
and even that is underpinned by kind of a moral system of government, right? Like a moral idea of what a right government is, which I have too, but it's probably.
Yeah, well, I would even say that,
which again is.
Oh, sorry, you broke out there, so I thought I'd jump in.
Go ahead.
So I would say that, well, I won't find it, but
no, go for it.
I don't necessarily think that. I think that the Lockean view, or the Adam Smith view of government, that's kind of his book on the relationship between man and the state. And the founders, I think, got it really nailed it as far as a minimalist principle. So, as far as what I am, I am a constitutional conservative, and I think government should be very, very small. I think Washington had 9 members in his cabinet. So, now what are we up to? 9 million.
It was a much smaller country.
Well, if we multiply,
much smaller deal.
If we multiplied it by the numbers, 13 state colonies, right? 13 states. So we can multiply it by 4, say, and so now we should have 36, and then we'll take whatever. But it wasn't anywhere near the proportion it is today. Either way, just basically a small federal government, states' rights, things like that. And I think that
I have problems with states' rights because I think often states don't respect individual sovereignty, and the history is the states are often looking to say, you're black, you're not so good. You people are poor, you're not so good. You guys don't deserve rights because we don't like you very much. And the federal government has a long history of saying, you know what? No, you're going to have to respect all those individual rights. So shut the F up and sit down.
Well, then I would say,
if states were always the vanguard of personal liberty, I would be a lot more of a states' rights guy. Unfortunately, they have this terrible history of being petty, small tyrants, and the federal government used as a hammer to break up that authority. I think that's good. Like the 14th Amendment, before the 14th Amendment, none of the Bill of Rights applied to everybody. It only applied to federal rules. So the federal rule, you could not keep you from having firearms. However, a state law could totally take away your right to have any gun whatsoever. And the federal government had no jurisdiction to say anything about it.
Yeah. And
however, the 14th Amendment, which came after slavery and the Civil War, said, you know what, the Bill of Rights, it applies to everybody all the time, and no state has the authority to take away those rights. And that is when the Second Amendment became the ability for any American to own firearms. Before that, it really just meant the federal government couldn't tell you, but your states were welcome to take away your guns all day long. Unless they had the state constitutional amendment, which about half of them did. So I think the federal government has played some super important roles in its strength in ensuring greater liberty, as where the states have a pretty sad history of doing that.
In some cases, but I think that's one of the great things about states' rights is if your state sucks, you move out of California, right? or you get
that is pretty easy to do these days. It didn't used to be that way.
But it's very difficult to move out of a country, right? It's like, where am I going to go anyways? I mean, if I'm a liberty-loving individual, there's nowhere outside the U.S. I could really see going. I mean, some people say Mexico because they're incompetent and small, but
right, yeah, you can go for a weak government. Yeah. Well, my family, some of my family were homesteaders and subsistence farmers in Alaska, and if you really don't like the government, you can go out into the bush in Alaska, and you won't see a government official all year long.
Yeah,
it's gonna be a hard life.
They didn't even know people lived, but
they do. Yeah, absolutely. My family lived off the grid.
Yeah, there's that TV show about people. They just, what are these people doing? Or tech. There's some states that are saying, hey, we're going to be a free state. Your state sucks. We're going to come live here. Yeah. They got the Free State Project. So I think those things are great. But the Bill of Rights. Remember, the foundation of the Bill of Rights was, okay, we've got this government forming, but we're afraid that it's just going to become King George VI, right? And so,
sure, some people were worried about that. Yeah,
yeah, and obviously,
some people wanted that.
Shockingly, they were right, right? So they say, hey, what we need is a specific outline of rights that individuals have. And so then they wrote the Bill of Rights, and now we talk about Second Amendment, which all it is basically a codification of the government recognizes that this pre-exists, right? You got the First Amendment with the 5 basic rights you have in the First Amendment: petition, religion, press, gather, and the 5th one, which if I took the time, I could think of it, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, and then you've got, these other basic rights government cannot. And so they said, these are rights we have. And so we want to make sure the government respects our pre-existing rights. Like Bastiat said,
sure,
that property doesn't exist because laws exist. Rather, laws exist because property already existed. And so, again, appealing to kind of a natural law type thing. And so when we form these governments, we have to make sure that governments respect rights that pre-existed them. But we know that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely everybody. And so what happens is generally people are, again, getting back to the example we said before, is people are pro-life and then they get into government and they want votes, or maybe they're pro-abortion, and they want to have a certain, they want to be in the Republican Party, so they go and they pretend. But generally when you get into government, you tend to lie, shocking, politicians lie. But
I know people who are in government who are very earnest, not lying people at all. They go in for very honest reasons. I think sometimes
those two people. Ron Paul and Rand Paul.
Yeah, well, I think they're very earnest. I disagree with a lot of their things, but they are earnest people. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of earnest people in government. Partly, the makes you lie because if you speak the truth, they vote you out of office. So you have to tell some platitudes, some kind of squishy things so that people don't overreact, if you know what I mean. To blame for people's dishonesty because they reward dishonesty.
People, like you said,
there's corruption in government.
Want to hear what they want to hear, even if they know it's impossible. I want my free healthcare. I want my free education. I want my free this.
Right.
I don't really care.
Yeah, I want my tax cuts and I want the budget balance at the same time on the other side. Right. Yeah, that's gonna happen.
Yeah, without cutting my Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security.
Right. Yeah. Don't take away any of my money for God's sake.
And I totally agree that is a problem. Let's cut the budget, but don't cut my thing. You can't cut that because that's my. Yeah. I'm a constituent there, so it'll never happen.
I want to tie the Constitution talk that we've done into the topic so that we can justify it. One of the things I think is interesting that ties into my view of moral subjectivity and the idea that we come together with different views and come up with something is that the Constitution, I listen to these college courses when I drive around everywhere, and I do a lot of driving. So, both listen to a lot of them on the Supreme Court and in American history.
Philosophize This. I just started listening to that. It's another good podcast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sounds interesting. Yeah. I listen to the great courses. They're basically college professors that give lectures that are recorded, and then you can buy them and listen to them. Okay. They're really cool. If you have like an Amazon Prime account, you can get some of them for free, which is what I do, because otherwise they're super expensive. But
Tom Woods,
they're really amazing.
Tom Woods homeschool program. But anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, so those are really cool. And people should educate themselves. It's important. So the Constitution, the way it was formed, is obviously, a lot of people got together, 55 guys, right, and try to figure out what they wanted to do. And there were points that they could agree upon, right? We want to get rid of English rule. There were points that they couldn't agree on, exactly how the federal government was supposed to work in some circumstances. So a lot of the things that you see, both in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution, are compromises. And a lot of those compromises were of this nature. Person A thinks something should work one way, and person B thinks another person should work a different way. So what they say is something kind of vague that leaves it open in the future for somebody to work that stuff out. So you get like the Ninth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which says, just because we listed these rights here, it doesn't mean those are all the rights there are. There are some other rights that people have naturally that we shouldn't make laws about. Done, right? That doesn't tell you a whole lot. And most jurisprudence judges will not make a judgment based on the Ninth Amendment, because you could have the right to stand on your head and flip burgers at people, right? They didn't say about it. Maybe that's one of those ones that isn't in there. But then again, there's also things like right to privacy, which we, regardless of your opinion on Roe v. Wade, is used in other things, like the police can't burst in your door and look through all your cupboards. We like that a lot.
Well, that's Fourth Amendment too. So
well, it's Fourth Amendment, and that's their argument, is the right to privacy is kind of undergirded by these other rights that are basically saying the government shouldn't invade my personal sphere, right? My individual sovereignty should not be subject to government whims. Yeah, well, and that's kind of what the Ninth Amendment's about. But it's open-ended, and they leave that there kind of open. And the Second Amendment, that you're going to argue about, was really, if I look at the literature and the way it's worded, it was created to say, look, the federal government cannot take away the right of citizens to be armed, because if they did, then we couldn't have militias in the states. And if the states didn't have militia and the federals have a standing army, then the federals can crush the states anytime they want. That's bad. So the federal government cannot have a say in whether or not people in states can be armed or not. And that's what its heart was. All the state militias pretty much are gone. I did research. There's a few kind of tiny little institutions with a single building somewhere around, but they're basically gone. So that whole rationale is gone. But with the Second Amendment, we still have those words, and it's a newer, purposeful for Americans. I believe in a right to self-defense, though there is none. I do think that's one of the rights that the Ninth Amendment really speaks to, is that we as individuals have a right to defend ourselves. The Second Amendment speaks to that, even though it's not exactly. So I think specifically made to have some wiggle room so that people, because of their differing views, can still form a single society and work these things out.
Yeah, and the 10th Amendment says, we said what you can't do, but it doesn't mean you can do everything else. And so the 10th Amendment center, actually, and it is a kind of a states' rights issue, that states can kind of come up with their own laws. But I would say that the things like the Ninth Amendment is kind of an appeal to a natural laws. Like these, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? That all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But you can't pursue happiness without property, without the right of self-defense, without, the right of privacy, the right of a whole variety of things. And so I think that's kind of where they were coming from. And I think most people
it is the philosophical underpinning of the United States, classic liberalism.
Yeah, and really, a lot of people do ignore the Declaration, but that is the document that founded the country, and with those words, right? And so in the course of human events and all that, but that it is founded on natural law. And so you could talk about, where does law come from? Well, that's kind of where it comes from. And so we can talk about the right of self-defense. The Second Amendment, it's twofold. It is the right of self-defense. I think that's the most applicable principle, but it also to defend and whether or not it's an actual actionable defense. People say, the government could come in and take your house out with an F-16. Yes,
they could.
But, that's unlikely, that even if we got a tyrant, that you would have a pilot come and do that. But even still, the government's going, and it's going door to door in Iraq and Afghanistan, and, it doesn't work real well. And if you figure 500 million firearms in the United States, if you got a tyrant in the White House, then they wouldn't be able to disarm America, I don't think, because of that principle, because so many people have guns. You're gonna have to go door to door. And, the anti-gunners are out there saying, hey, we'd like to take the guns away, but how are we going to take them away? Well, we're going to send people with guns around, and they're going to take guns away, right? So they're going to prove to the people that want their guns exactly what they hold their guns for, which is a tyrannical government coming to take your guns.
I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, right? But
because of that, because of the fact
that's the concern.
Yeah, there are 500 million, and you have a whole culture in America,
and it's a democracy / republic, right? And really, I think it's a kind of a two-sided coin. That is what protects those gun rights, but that is also why those gun rights are not as necessary as people make them out to be, because the democratic system, the checks and balances that were set up in the government, and the way our society works, tends to make that kind of violent rebellion unnecessary. And that's kind of the brilliance of the system. So Yeah, but I'm a weird person on the Second Amendment and gun control rights. I kind of argue against everybody. I think everybody's wrong, and that it's purely the things that people, gun control advocates want to solve are purely social issues, and the justifications that gun rights people use are often kind of antiquated and unrealistic, right? And so I tend to rain on everybody's parade. So I can't start a topic other than everybody but me is wrong, right? So that's not very useful.
Well, hence the self-morality. So what we do is we come in with force and make you change your morality. And then we win.
When we disagree, that is how it gets sorted out, unfortunately. But all right, well, it's been a great talk with you. We're almost out of time. So
all right, nice discussion. Siegfried, have a good night.
All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.